simplifying things a little bit, but what are we getting here? We're getting a bony box around the inner guts of the animal. So that if we add our appendages, that animal standing or walking, the forces are going to be directed around the innards to the vertebral column for support. So when that animal steps, its whole weight is not pushing its leg into its intestines. Instead, those forces are directed around the soft tissue to that hard, bony vertebral column that is going to support the animal. Pectoral girdle in fishes is a little more complex than is the pelvic, but it also attaches to the skull. So a fish cannot move its head independent of its body. Its pectoral girdle is attached to its head. I'll show you a diagram in a minute here. And that's probably important in stabilizing the head against that lateral component that is a necessary evil, if you will, of the way they locomote by lateral undulation. Remember, we have a forward component and a lateral component. By stabilizing your head up against your pectoral girdle, it may be a way to keep your head from bouncing back and forth as much. In any event, amphibians lose this connection to the head, so they're going to be able to get some independent movement of the head and body started. And instead of attaching to the head, the pectoral girdle is going to attach by soft tissue to the vertebral column. It will be something like this. So there are my legs again. The number of bones that are going to contribute to the pectoral girdle varies with the different groups of vertebrates, but again, the principles are the same. So in a mammal, for example, that part of the pectoral girdle would be the scapula, and this part over here would be the clavicle. Two. So your collarbone, for example. It is the collarbone. So we don't have a bony connection to the vertebral column like we do in the pelvic girdle, but we're accomplishing the same thing. So these lines here are representing soft tissue, connective tissue, and muscle. But you can see then that the forces are directed around the innards of the animal. So this animal is gaining support against gravity by having these complex pectoral and pelvic girdles. So they have the same function in the fish, and that is bracing, supporting the limb, and providing places for muscles to attach. But it also assumes a more important function of helping to support the animal against gravity and to keep its insides from being crushed. So, anyway, there's some very early amphibians indicating our arch. So we have an arch in that one, an arch in that one. Not so much there, but the other ones do. So on this right here, what they're trying to show you is the pectoral girdle, so the front one in the fish versus the early amphibian. So that here is your pectoral girdle, and you can see that it is attaching to all of the bones associated with the skull. in this very early terrestrial animal, we are separating that pectoral girdle from the skull over here. So they're totally separated. Now we can get independent movement of the head and the pectoral girdle. And we're coming up and making our soft tissue connections to the vertebral column for support. Let's see. Oh, this was just showing how simple the pelvic girdle is in a fish. It's down in the ventral body wall. There's really nothing connected to it. And then we make it more complex for our terrestrial vertebrates and have bony connections right up to the vertebrae. And this is the diagrammatic way of presenting things that I put on the board. So this would be your pelvic girdle. So we have that sacral rib. Here's my sacral vertebrae, the ilium, then an ischium, and then a pubis down here. Here's your pectoral girdle. Again, there would be your scapula, here would be your clavicle. These are ribs coming down. We have that soft tissue connection that is providing us with the support. And then up at the top, they're just showing you the structure of those in different animals. Okay, that's not that important. Make sense how we're getting support? Okay, so a very fundamental thing that had to happen in these animals. Okay, one other thing about support and locomotion is that there is a change in muscles, a change in the sense of what are the most important muscles, what are the most abundant muscles. So we looked at a fish, we spoke about myomeres, these segmented pieces of muscle up and down the trunk of the animal. They were important because they were providing that lateral undulation that was used in locomotion. The fins in a fish have very little muscle associated with them. So the fin musculature might only be 5%, 10% of the entire muscle mass of the fish. So when you go and eat a fish, you are eating the myomeres up and down the trunk because that's the main part of the muscle. There's hardly anything associated with the fins because they're just using them for a little bit for stability and maneuverability. When you come out onto land, there is a shift so that your locomotion now is being accomplished largely by your limbs, by the appendages. And so consequently, there's a shift in the abundance of muscle. We're going to have less trunk muscle in terrestrial vertebrates, and we're going to increase the amount of the muscles associated with the appendages. So most of the time when you're eating beef or pork, you're eating the appendicular muscles, muscles of the shoulder, muscles of the hip. When you eat fish, you're mostly eating the trunk muscles instead. There's a gradual loss of these trunk muscles. So amphibians tend to have a lot more than a reptile does. Reptiles have more than mammals and birds. So you do get a gradual disappearance or gradual lessening in the importance of those muscles. Okay? And it makes sense because they're no longer functioning in locomotion. Instead, the appendages are functioning in locomotion. Okay. All right. Let's, we're going to look at some various features of amphibians. Let's start with reproduction. So what we're going to do is we're going to compare and contrast reproductive patterns in our three main groups of amphibians, our apodans, the salamanders, and the frogs and the toads. In order to do that, I want to define some terms. oviparous, ovoviviparous, and viviparous. So the parous part at the end is just coming from the Latin word to part, to leave. So what we're talking about is essentially what's leaving the mother. So you can see egg or ovum in the first one. Oviparous animals are egg-laying animals. It's the egg that parts the mother, the egg that leaves the mother. Down here, viviparous, the vivipart refers to life. So what is leaving the mother is a miniature adult. Right? Not an egg, but a functioning animal. It's a live birth as opposed to an egg being laid. So mammals are obviously viviparous. Most. Ovoviviparous, it's sort of in between in the sense, yes, we are having a live animal leaving the mother. It is a live birth. But the distinction between ovoviviparous and viviparous is more one of how is the youngster being fed, how is it obtaining nutrients while it is inside the mother. So normally, true viviparity, there would be some mechanism for the mother to supply nutrients to that developing offspring from her own body. Now take a mammal for example, that's going to be the placenta. And there are other ways in which mammals can do something similar. Right? In other words, the youngster can have some tissue that is in intimate contact with maternal tissues that allows it to obtain some nutrients. Ovoviviparous indicates that most of the energy, though, that is being used by that developing young comes from the egg, comes from the yolk of the egg. So there's not a hard and fast rule here how much has to come from the yolk before it's called ovoviviparous as opposed to viviparous. Right? So there's a continuum between those. But the implication is both have live birth. Viviparous, essentially all of the nutrients are coming directly from the mother's system, whereas in ovoviviparous, a substantial amount is coming from the yolk of the egg. So those of you that took comparative anatomy and we dissected the shark, those sharks are really ovoviviparous. You can cut them open, you can find the developing young fish on the inside of the mother in her uterus, but then there's a ping-pong sized ball of yolk that's attached to that developing offspring. And that's where it's getting most of its nutrients from. All right, so three major modes. Okay. The apodons, are mostly viviparous or oviparous. I'm sorry, mostly viviparous or ovo. So majority, perhaps 75%, have live birth. About 25% are going to be egg-laying or oviparous. Males have a copulatory organ. In effect, it's just the lower end of its cloaca. Did we define cloaca in here?
Sure, right?
Yep. It is the Latin word for sewer, and it's good because that helps you remember. In many animals, let's see, this is my digestive tract, this is my urinary tract, and this is my reproductive tract. They all join together inside the body so that you have one tube in common through which the products of all three of those systems will flow. That, by definition, is a cloaca. So among mammals, in the monotremes, we still have a cloaca, for example. Birds have a cloaca, reptiles have a cloaca, just about everything else does have one. they have a single external opening for all three systems.